We're going to talk about mental health and neurodiversity. We'll start with some introductions. Do you want to go first, Rebekah?
I'm Rebekah Muttitt. I work at NSFT in CAMS and youth, particularly in the NDD part of the pathway.
And I'm Melanie Bruce. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work for Norfolk Community Health and Care NH Trust in Children's Learning Disability Services. But Rebekah and I do a lot of work together with children and young people with neurodevelopmental differences when there's concerns around mental health and or behaviour. So we do quite a lot of work together. We've got a rough plan for today and we're happy to talk about our understanding of mental health in neurodiversity and what that means and what we think that should mean and what we think should happen about it. But we're also really mindful that it's a really, really important subject for people, and people might have very clear questions that they'd like us to try and answer or signpost you about, or things that we'd particularly like to cover. So please do use the chat function. Please do put your hands up if there's things you particularly want us to talk more about, or you've got questions. And at the end, we'll make sure we leave enough space for some questions and answer then as well. I can't see the chat, but I'm presuming if somebody does write a chat, then I will be able to see it, and between us we'll keep an eye on it.
I've just opened it and I think I can probably see it when people type now, I think.
Great.
If not, I think we're being helped with that as well.
Great. Brilliant. Okay. So Rebekah and I thought that perhaps before we start, we should be pretty honest about things that trigger us. So I'm sure you're all aware of the word trigger, and I'm sure you've all had lots of conversations about what triggers are. But Rebekah and I are quite clear about certain things that trigger us and that really bother us. So we've just listed a few down. And I think one of the biggest ones is when we hear phrases such as, well, they are very anxious, but they're autistic. And the level of anxiety that they're experiencing is what we'd expect for somebody who's autistic. That particularly upsets Rebekah and I. But it's something that we hear quite a lot of. Is it behaviour or is it mental health? Is another one that we hear quite a lot, and wanting us to separate it. There was or is no trigger, or the trigger isn't enough. So I often hear things like, well, we did change that person's routine, but we changed it on other days and it was okay. So therefore it shouldn't have been an issue today, for example. I've put it like this because it could be referring to anybody, don't understand other people's feelings. Again, we often get that as an explanation as to why somebody may or may not have mental health difficulties. And particularly their neurodiversity means that they can't access mental health interventions, is another one that particularly upsets us. I can see some stuff flashing. Is that a chat?
No, it's just Ben saying that
great,
he'll be keeping an eye on things and you can leave questions.
Great. And if I was in the room, the speaker button nodding for these triggers. Yeah, they are. Oh gosh, hang on.
Yeah, and when we talk about the triggers that trigger us, but also that we've heard from lots of people in here, from colleagues and obviously from families and other people as well. So we're aware that it isn't just us who also get upset and cross about hearing these things over and over again.
Okay, should we move on?
I think so.
Do you want to talk about this page, Rebekah? Or
yeah, sorry, I'm just
no, that's okay.
The whole thing's flashing. So one of the things about mental health, and obviously we know that people talk about lots of things when we talk about ASD, NDD issues, ADHD, tics, Tourette's, PDA, lots of conversations. But actually we're talking about mental ill health labels, and I guess we want to try and avoid some of the words that come up. We know that people may have diagnosis, but actually we're really wanting to think about, when we're talking about anxiety or depression or self-esteem or psychosis or eating, lots of words are spoken about or added into referrals, what they actually mean, and thinking actually more about what we're seeing, about the facts. So rather than saying we think this person presents as depressed or with anxiety, really thinking about what we see. So what is it that's happening for that person, or what people are seeing that would mean that person ends up being, I guess, either diagnosed by perhaps schools or other people or families, and also trying to, the same conversation about treatments really. People will sometimes have referrals, or people will sometimes think about the fact, oh, please look after this youngster because they need medication, or need talking therapies, or they need something. And actually what we're thinking about is, what are the problems, what's being presented, what are people concerned about, so what are the facts? And then we think about treatments, what might that look like? And it doesn't have to look like coming into a clinic room, having medication and having a talking therapy. And I think we need to really try and find out a way to work around for all of us to stop those being the only options. So if you're not got a diagnosis and you're not in a talking therapy, people then feel people aren't having services or not got a problem. And so we particularly want to try and work out a way that people can get the support they need without perhaps a traditional wording being used, and try and move away from those labels particularly.
And I think, I mean, I don't know, I think sometimes people's experiences, if they don't have a diagnosis of mental ill health, or if they don't see a particular mental health professional, I think sometimes people's experiences, then it feels a bit like their problems aren't seen as significant enough, or they're not distressed enough. And actually we want to come away from that as well, because if somebody is distressed and somebody is upset and they're struggling, then absolutely that's important, that's valid, and nobody's taking that away. But I think sometimes people do feel that their distress isn't being heard, or people aren't necessarily understanding it, because people get caught up in bouncing around services and people making decisions about things which don't make a difference to their lives. I suppose the other thing to think about is mental health is such a huge term. And when people say mental health, we assume that we're talking about people's mental ill health rather than their mental health and well-being. So if I was to talk about my physical health, I might say it's good, or it's poor, or it's whatever, and it's the same with mental health. So again, mental health isn't just being mentally unwell, it is everything that we need to do to keep our mental health good and balanced and well, and be resilient, and to be able to do those things. Sometimes when things have become really, really difficult, it might mean that it meets the criteria for some of those diagnoses, but if it doesn't mean that anybody is sort of less distressed or not worthy or not important for interventions.
And that everybody can have, we all aim to have mental health, to, I guess, avoid or try to consider how we lessen the impact of mental illness. So I think people sometimes say, oh, they've got mental health issues. Well, I think we need to, like Mel said, we all can have, that's not some particular just to people with NDD issues, but we also need to make sure that we all look after our own well-being. I guess it's often a better word to use, but I think people see well-being as a less important thing than mental health. So it's a kind of a less than again. So, oh, they've only got mental well-being issues, not mental health issues. So I think we're particularly interested in trying to think about, again, talking about what the issues are, what we need to think about, rather than necessarily label everybody. I think that's sometimes, I'm not sure services do that, but I think people get quite caught up, but they haven't got a diagnosis of, so therefore they can't have. And we want to obviously try and find a way to work around that as well.
Which I guess does lead on to our next slide, which is about what we think is important, but also what children and young people and their families who we work with tell us is important. So we're not, Rebekah and I are not coming at this from an expert position. We're coming at this from having worked with children and families and listening to them, and hearing from them about what their experiences are. And one of the big things is a diagnosis. And again, we do often spend a lot of time saying, a diagnosis in itself can be really, really helpful. But a diagnosis in itself doesn't tell us how we can help that person's mental health to get better. So for example, if I was to become depressed, somebody could tell me that I meet the criteria for depression. I could do some questionnaires and I could tick all the boxes to say that I meet the criteria for depression, but that doesn't mean then that I can get a treatment that's going to make me feel better, because the treatment for me will need to be about me as a person, and about all the things that have happened to me to lead me to that point. And again, that's the same for all of us. That's not just for people with neurodevelopmental differences. That is for everybody. So diagnosis is a part of it, But how Rebekah and I would work would be much more a formulation, which can include a diagnosis, but is essentially a bit of a story really, about that person. So this is the person, this is who they are, this is what's important to them. These are all the things that have been happening, and this is what happens to them on a daily basis. And this explains why they feel the way they do, and this explains what's happening. And it's a formulation that helps us to put the right support and the right interventions in for people rather than a diagnosis. And particularly for people with neurodiversity, understanding the person as a whole is absolutely crucial. So I think probably on the trigger sheet we should have written, when people say to me, so is that to do with their mental health, Mel, or is that because they're autistic? Or if they weren't autistic, what would be happening now? And trying to separate people into different diagnostic labels rather than, there's lots of things that make us all up as a person, and understanding all of them is important, not trying to separate them, but that does happen quite a lot.
And also the other way, I suppose, I can see people in the chat are talking about diagnosis as well, but I think that also something that happens when people perhaps have a situation where they'll say, well, like what they can't have that treatment because they've got neuro differences, or we can't offer that because, and well, actually, what would you offer instead, or what can I do? What would you do normally? The service could still happen. It just need to think of a way we make that work. And I think that's the other way that also, I guess, gets quite difficult. And I can see in the chat people are talking about kind of the fact that diagnosis is important because people don't get services if there's not a diagnosis. And I think that's what we want to try and, we know they're important and diagnosis can be very important. We're not advocating that nobody ever gets a diagnosis ever, but we're thinking about the fact that, of course, not everybody needs one. And we need to work with people regardless.
I suppose we should be, yeah, and I guess we should be really clear as well that when we were talking about diagnosis, we meant diagnosis of a mental health condition, not necessarily a diagnosis of autism or something like that. So I think I come across lots of people who say, so am I depressed? Do I have bipolar? Have I got a psychotic illness? And actually that diagnosis in itself doesn't necessarily make a difference. It is understanding all of those things together. And being non-stigmatizing, again, is really, really important. So those trigger bits around, is it because they're autistic? Is it because they've got ADHD? And, all of those things can potentially feel a bit blaming or feel like that's the reason somebody has mental ill health. Whereas that's, obviously that's not helpful, and that's not how we want people to think about things. It's not a stigmatism. It's about understanding every individual's experiences and what's happening. And the bit that Rebekah touched on earlier in terms of what do mental health interventions look like. So again, I think traditionally we might think that looks like talking therapy or possibly medication, but actually mental health interventions can be huge and varied, and don't have to include talking therapy. Sometimes that's really important, but there's lots of other stuff that can be done that improves people's mental health, that doesn't look like traditional mental health interventions.
And equally, and I can see that's being talked about in the chat a bit as well, and I'm sorry, we'll get to the chat at the end, and Ben's keeping an eye on to that too. But I guess the other thing which we know happens lots is that people may get referred with already diagnosis of NDD something, so ASD, ADHD, or combinations of, and people will want a service, but people say there's not mental illness. And I think this is difficult because we still have, we still do have criteria for our services, but there's more than 2 services. And I think that's, we also need to consider the fact that people sometimes feel they're being turned away because of the ASD, when actually they're being turned away because there's no mental illness. And we're not pretending this is perfect. We're certainly not pretending that that service is all there and available for everybody to have, and there's no problems in Norfolk or anywhere else in the country or the world. But I think that's the bit we also want to try and get right. That sometimes people feel they're being told they can't have a service because they have ASD, when in fact it might be more the fact that people are trying to work out what's the most supportive for people, because we don't want people to be labelled with mental illness when they don't have that. And I think that's the bit we want to stop people talking about what diagnosis they have and what labels they have to get a service. But we also recognise that many services, including our own, do have a criteria to be able to have the services we offer. But there are lots of the services. It's about us formulating and finding the right people to support. And we do need more services. I mean, nobody's pretending we don't need more. I can see that's
we do also know that really sadly, but we do know it repeatedly, is that people or young people who have learning disabilities, who are autistic, who have neurodevelopmental differences, very sadly are more likely to experience mental health difficulties or mental distress, but we also know much less likely to be understood as part of that. So we do know that. We know that, you know, the rates of mental health are much higher, but the way that that's understood and responded to and recognised and noticed is much less. And that's something that we absolutely, you know, not just in Norfolk, but as a whole society need to get much better at. Is it worth just stopping and picking up anything from the chat at this point, Rebekah?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it is, because
just clarify.
I was just thinking of maybe just jumping in a second. One of the questions here that I did notice is about we've got Emma, who's saying about her daughter and how she had a late diagnosis, and that's obviously had a knock-on effect in the mental health issues. And what non-talking therapies are on offer for cases like that. What
talking therapies or what non-talking therapies?
From what
non-talking, I think
is maybe Emma's daughter is non-verbal. Maybe if you could maybe expand on that, Emma, in the chat. That's all.
So what Emma's saying is, Mel's the daughter was not diagnosed in childhood with ASD. She didn't get any help in childhood, and that resulted in mental health issues. So it's not clear they have mental health issues, but they do not get help. And what non-talking therapies do you offer? I think is a question. So yeah, so I don't know, like Bented, I don't know if
so I guess, I mean, I think
that's...
like we said at the beginning, mental health is enormous. Everybody has mental health, and we know that, you know, some people are more likely to have mental health difficulties. Lots of different groups of people. We'll come on to it a bit, I think, a bit later in terms of what might make things better and what might help, and we're going to try and use a bit of a model to explain it and to structure that. But I guess one of the things that we also know is that a late diagnosis of autism, not being understood as being autistic, and often girls with autism particularly are missed and spend a lot of years trying really hard to understand the world and not understanding it, and so live in a world that's really stressful for them. So there's a much, you know, bigger need for girls who are autistic, people who present slightly differently, to be understood much better, their needs recognised much earlier on to prevent that from happening. But in terms of non-talking interventions, so I work in learning disability services, so a lot of the young people that I work with, they all have communication difficulties, but a lot of them are sort of described as pre-verbal or don't use any words. And there are absolutely mental health interventions that you can do for people like that who aren't able to verbally communicate. Some of that's around environmental changes, but a lot of it is around regulation, self-soothing, ways of comforting, and all the things that we would do through words, but doing them in different ways for that person.
And I think what is also being said is that actually, I think Emma's just answering to say that if anxiety or find it difficult to talk, so no non-talking, also that CBT in autism is very difficult. And I guess that we will talk about this a bit more later, but I guess that's something we can also just touch on here, is that we are, and some people have been on the groups, Mel, you'll be aware, we are now very fortunate to have 5 new positions available for people. We've just been interviewing this week, particularly for, I mean, a CBT informed therapy, but particular therapies that are actually working with youngsters, particularly with LD or ASD. And so that training is be happening over next year for some people who are already working in learning services or with children with complex needs, to be able to have 5 new posts. We will talk about it a bit more later on properly, but so there is a thought about, we've already thought about it, and we've been successful in getting 5 posts. We appreciate that 5 is not going to be enough to answer these problems. But I think it would be a good start to be able to think about different ways of working that isn't just about people and being told, like I can see people are being told in the chat, you know, CBT isn't going to work, that's all we have to offer, so sorry. And that's obviously not what we want people to be told and not what we want to be on offer. And we know there's not enough, and 5 won't be enough. But if we can do that each year and keep building on that and help other people have additional skills too, hopefully we'll get to a point where everybody is able to offer that in an adjusted way that is enough.
And I guess, I mean, I suppose almost the point of our presentation, the reason we're going to go through the bucket model is that we don't want anybody, whether they've got neurodevelopmental differences or not, to be put into a box. So this is what you're referred for, therefore you have CBT. This is what's happening, therefore that happens, because actually that's not what works for people. People need individualized intervention plans that suit them, that take into account them as a whole person, but do not slot them into boxes. And you know, somebody might not be suitable for CBT. That to me says that they'd find it really difficult to sit in a room for 50 minutes and to talk about thoughts, feelings and behaviors. That's not their fault that that's difficult. That's the role of other people to make adjustments and to find ways so that they can do that. And that often is the task of the therapist, or using CBT informed approaches, but not in a traditional talking way. I think we sometimes think that's the only way to do CBT, but it really isn't. It can be used in lots of different ways.
There's it's also some talk about the fact that people are saying in their area, sort of where it is, CAM do not support ASD children and mental health as it's ASD related. I mean, I think certainly, and it might be this area, but I think you certainly should be challenging that, because services cannot say you can't offer something because somebody has ASD. If it's
absolutely not,
mental health is the issue, then we need to look at where that might be together and where that looks similar, or which parts we can look at. But actually, people being turned away, apart from local moral and local actual criteria, the Equality Act and the Autism Act would be very clear, even if you needed that, to say that you cannot, service cannot offer support to someone with ASD. If it's because of the ASD, the problems are there, that might be a different conversation. It might not be mental illness, but we can't be splitting children into little bits and saying, well, the ASD looked at there and mental health looked at there, because that's obviously not going to work. That's one person. So I don't know which area that is, but that might be, if it's our area, then I apologise, and I hope we can maybe sort that out. But I think the problem does often come from the fact that what youngsters are referred for, we get 2 lines from a GP or from whoever saying, please see these youngsters with ASD. Well, we don't know any more than that. I think that's sometimes the problem.
It is that bit about separating people and not seeing people as the whole person, yes. And that shouldn't happen for people with neurodevelopmental differences, or for anybody. If I was to seek help for my mental health, I wouldn't expect anybody to say, well, which bit of that is about Mel, who is a psychologist, and which bit about that is Mel, who is a sister. We don't separate people. That's not helpful.
One direct question, Mel, before we just move to the next bit, then maybe we can come back to some of these questions, is people are saying that, I'm asking you because this is about starfish. They're saying, why are lots of children who have autism but no learning disability not able to access starfish in West Norfolk? I guess you're the best person to probably answer.
Yeah, so I work in Starfish Plus, which is a slightly different service, but still very closely linked. So Starfish and Starfish Plus is a service for children who have learning disabilities. A lot of the children we see are also autistic, but the service is for children who have a learning disability. So if you have a learning disability and you have concerns around behaviour that challenges and or mental health, then you can have a referral to Starfish. But if you don't have a learning disability, then Starfish wouldn't be the right service. And that's partly because it is a learning disability service. The people who work there are skilled and trained in working with children with learning disabilities. And whilst we might do lots of work with autistic children, if it's an autistic child who doesn't have a learning disability, it might not be the right service for them, and it might not be the staff team with the right skill mix for that.
But one of the things we're doing locally is people from other parts of the county, but also other parts of the country on here as well. But actually, by triaging, so when the referrals come into our service, if we have all the services together looking at what's being asked, we can then hopefully get to the right place to find out where people need to go to get the best support. So rather than a referral to starfish, and it's not starfish, it's a referral to paediatrics, not paediatrics, what we do is, and we already have been doing this for a while, but actually more and more so, doing the people referrals together. So people ask for help, we look together what the help's needed, work out what could be the best plan to work forward and offer the best service, rather than it's a no from me and a yes from you. And because I think that's what it's not appropriate for anybody to have that. Nobody wants that for anybody, but I'm aware that is what happens, and we also want to try and stop, but certainly reduce that happening. And I can see people are saying in their area they're told it's ASD, so they can't have a referral.
I mean, again, I think that really does need to be challenged, because that is, as Rebekah says, under disability discrimination. You're excluding somebody on the basis that they're autistic, and that's not, that's not okay. It might be that people feel really worried and don't know how to make suitable adjustments and are going to struggle to understand that person, but that shouldn't be a reason for people not being able to be referred.
People are saying it sounds great, but it doesn't happen in Norfolk, and we're not pretending that it's all great and it does happen. We know that, which is why we're all trying to work together to find out to make it happen. It has to happen. It isn't acceptable that there isn't an answer that it can't happen. We have to find a way for people to get the services they need.
Absolutely, yeah, and we know that we've got huge gaps. We know that our commissioners know that we've got lots of gaps. We're really aware of that, and I guess lots of you guys who are here are campaigning for that. Lots of people like Rebekah and I are campaigning for that, because we are aware that things could be much better for not just children and young people, for adults as well. I wonder if it's worth sort of briefly running through the model, Rebekah, but I'm mindful there's lots of questions, which is fine. I think if the questions are more about services rather than understanding mental health, then we can focus on that. It depends what the group would prefer us to do. Yeah,
there's quite a lot of people in the room, so I don't know if there's a feeling. It's difficult in the room itself to ask people directly, isn't it? I don't know, we can do a vote on here, I think. Ben, have you got that on your system?
I'm not sure. Is there a vote, Lee? Is there a vote thing?
There is a vote, but I'm not sure. I don't think we have access. I don't know if you did. I was just wondering if people wanted to say, we were thinking about the idea of the bucket model, I suppose, because it's something we all think about using, but I guess traditionally perhaps it's been used more with people. Yeah, people want ideas about services and signposting.
Say it is very much, as all the chat has mainly been around what services are available, and sort of it seems that the chat's really, that's what they mainly want to know, is services and where to go, because obviously there's multiple people here that they're obviously, they feel lost because there doesn't seem to be a direction for them.
Yeah, and I think we know that, services. As I said, we know that, and we are working on it. All of us are working, many people, not just two, but there's loads of things happening, and it isn't here yet. I mean, there are some really good services around and available, but I know that there still isn't enough. And it's a bit of a mix, because some people are talking about they would like some ideas of strategies to offer support, and some people are asking for ideas and services. So it's a bit of both, to be honest. Ben, this chat you'll save this, won't you? So we'll be able to reply to people after this chat.
Plus, because the person after you is not, that they're a recording, so this chat hasn't technically, other than you can go over time if needs be.
Okay.
I think because it's a mixture of, if I was doing a rough vote from that, I think strategies are probably slightly harder than services, but I'm not sure that that's.
I think it's not an either or, is it?
No, it's both, absolutely.
I think, like as we were saying at the beginning, like mental health affects lots of us in lots of different ways, and the ways in which we will recover from mental health or feel better is sometimes accessing mental health services, sometimes having you know, talking therapies, all those sorts of things. But often it's about our whole lifestyle, and it's about how we create a world around us that promotes our mental health and helps us to recover. So again, if I was to become depressed and seek help for that, talking therapies could be something that's really helpful for me. That would be a very small part of it. What would be a huge help to me would be my family and friends understanding, and me creating lots of things around me that would help me to feel better. So it's a both as well, isn't it? Sometimes services are really important, but also creating worlds that protect someone's mental health is a big part of that recovery as well. Which I guess
very
is
direct questions that we can look at perhaps slightly aside as well. I mean, I think, and we know that there's lots of other questions, so maybe we need to answer that as well. I think people having some ideas about possible strategies is also wanted. So I wonder if we haven't got very long. We also do a little bit of the bucket model idea to think about where that might fit.
Well, I think, I mean, if we'll whiz through it very quickly, but we'll particularly focus on the sort of strategies and the understanding. And I think, again, the bucket model people have probably heard of in terms of stress. They've probably heard of it in terms of behaviour. You know, whether we want to call that challenging behaviour, behaviours of concern, meltdowns, that's often how it's talked about. But similarly, it's a really, really useful model for mental health. It's really useful because it is non-stigmatizing. It is something that we all have and that we all work with, and it stops that distinction as well between is this behavior or is this mental health. Because my view is, if somebody's distressed, somebody's distressed, and sometimes people might show that through mental health symptoms, and some people might show that through having a meltdown, but ultimately they're distressed, and that's what matters. So I think the bucket model is quite useful to just structure us through that. The thing that's really, really important is that we are absolutely not suggesting that people with neurodevelopmental differences have smaller buckets. That's absolutely not what we're suggesting at all. I would suggest that actually people with neurodevelopmental differences probably have a greater capacity for stress than a lot of other people, because the world is much more stressful and things are often much, much harder in lots of ways. So I certainly don't think it's that their capacity for stress or upset or any of those things is less. And the size and the shape of it is not the thing that is, you know, it's not for judgment, it's not for sort of review, because we all have our own threshold. We all know what we can manage and what we can't manage, and that varies individually, and that might change because of how our brains work. It might change because of things that have happened to us recently or perhaps when we were younger, but it's how much stress or how much of those things we can take is not changeable or negotiable or anything that should be judged. It's just the way we are, and it's something that we need to understand. So the idea is that we would all have a bucket that can hold all of these things, and then various things would fill it up. And again, just a few key points about that, particularly when thinking about neurodiversity, is that there is absolutely no judgment on what fills it up, and they're all things that are unique to us. So again, I think those comments like, well, I don't think that was such a big thing, or I don't think it was that important. Actually, it's not our place to judge what causes somebody to feel very, very stressed. What causes me to feel really unhappy and really sad might not make somebody else feel that way. It doesn't mean that I'm any less sad. And if someone tells me that, well, you shouldn't really be that sad about that, Mel, that's not validating. That doesn't make me feel better. So absolutely no judgment on the things that cause us to feel upset. And things that can fill our bucket up, again, can be really quick. So, you know, I could be having a really lovely time, great for a few weeks, and then very quickly feel very upset, or it could happen very gradually. And again, that can change over time. So sometimes things happen, particularly for people who might have differences in how they process information. Things might seem okay, and then a few days later, things are really not okay. And that's not because, I don't know, it's not because that person is choosing to not be okay. It's because that's the point at which maybe that information has been processed, and that's the point at which it's happened. For some of the young people that we work with, one of the sort of warning signs for us that we've got written down is when people say things like, they handled that really well. because our sense of people saying that is, oh, they might have looked like they did and they might have gone okay in the moment, but actually a few days later that might really have an effect on them. We might really see how upset they were about it. So those things are really important, and also the level of our buckets directly impacts on what we see. So again, my experience, and it's only my experience of working with children and young people with neurodevelopmental differences, is that the more full their bucket is, and whether that means that they're more sad or they're more anxious or they're more restless or they're more stressed, but the more full that their bucket is, actually for a lot of them, they're less able to do some of the things that they're then able to do. So things that perhaps they ordinarily can do, like, I don't know, follow instructions, make a choice, ask for help. When somebody's bucket's quite full, that can become much, much harder. So we sometimes see children presenting as almost less able at the times when their buckets are really full, which again, I think is really, really important, because that can look like, and is, a mental health picture. And again, I don't think that's just about neurodevelopmental differences. If I was very, very anxious, incredibly distressed, on alert, and perhaps close to being really, really unwell, I wouldn't be able to make choices. I wouldn't be able to communicate. I wouldn't be able to process information as well as I can. But people would probably still expect me to be able to do that, and they wouldn't lower the expectations around me. So I think that's also really important to remember, that we might see a different way that that young person is when their bucket's really full. Did I explain that all right, Rebekah?
I think so. We haven't got any other questions coming through at the moment. We've got lots of questions, but not about that directly, I don't think.
Okay.
Answer, but...
So briefly, when our buckets are really full, what happens? And this is I guess where we see mental ill health. So when buckets are either really full or really spilling over, that's what we see. And again, it's not a case of it spills over for half an hour and then we're okay again. It might be spilling over for a really long time. It might never actually get down below the top of the bucket, and that, you know, we could, and we have, with particularly young people, seen that in children who could be described as having a psychotic illness, an eating disorder, OCD, anxiety, depression, really, you know, significant meltdowns. It could be all of those things. But essentially the idea of the bucket model is we don't then start to separate children and say, was it this, was it that? It's that actually all of this together makes things really hard, and then the spilling over is what happens when the person is so distressed. And when our buckets are really full, often we end up blocking the holes in our buckets. So again, we all do that. So I know that when my bucket's quite full, I can't organise and prioritise myself very well. I work too many hours. I try and cram everything in, and then I stop doing the things that make me well. So one of the things that I really enjoy is going to the gym and lifting weights, and the minute that I'm stressed, I'm like, I haven't got time to do that, so I stop doing the things that would reduce my stress levels. And I think again, lots of our children and young people do that. We have somebody who really, really enjoys just being on their own, making loads of noise by themselves, doing lots of stimming, really enjoys doing that, but finds that really hard to do when they're really, really stressed. So then we're almost adding to the bucket, because the things that would put holes in it are much harder to do when someone's really stressed. And what happens when it spills over? So we've talked a bit about that in terms of mental health and what that might look like. So I guess, I mean, part of it obviously is we would love it if people's buckets didn't get full up. That would be amazing. And often, you know, often the world is filling people's buckets up in a way that doesn't need to happen. Sometimes we need to change the world around them, and things can get much better. But sometimes, unfortunately, that, you know, those things we can't always control, or we can't always take away, or they are things that are really important. So the idea then is that we can put holes in our bucket so that we can reduce the stress levels and manage these things as they're coming in. And I guess this is what we mean about alternatives to talking therapy. So talking therapy is a hole in somebody's bucket, can also fill it up as well, because it can be really hard and really stressful. But it absolutely is a hole in somebody's bucket, but it's one hole, and lots of other things can help at the same time. So my experience of working with autistic young people with at times really significant mental health problems is that the thing that has absolutely made the biggest difference to them has been making the word autism friendly. So, you know, putting in all the things that they absolutely need to support them because they're autistic in terms of their structure, their routine, sensory activities, time to go out and regulate, ways of comforting them, ways of asking for help, communication strategies, all the things that we think of as autism interventions. If they're not in place, somebody's mental health is going to struggle more, and we have to get those back in place first. And they're often the things that make a huge difference to somebody when their mental health is really struggling. And then we add in the more mental health interventions as part of that and on top of that, but they're still really relevant. I guess that's the point. They're still really important and they really make a difference. And if we don't have those, then the young person is going to really struggle to feel better. So we have to get those things in too. Do you want to add anything, Rebekah?
Well, I was going to say, particularly what we know, but I guess in the chat as well, people talking lots about when youngsters are at school, they are fine, not fine, but they're masking, and actually they come home and it's a very different conversation, and how that, and I guess that if we think about how this fits into the story and how we're thinking about overspilling and how manages, the fact that we were also, and we talked about this earlier as well, that sometimes the holes and buckets can get very bunged up with something, and sometimes I think people try their best to do what they can do. And I guess people will say, well, they do well at school because it's a good environment and structure. And that might be true, but you're absolutely right. They may well just be managing that part of the day. But unfortunately, when people see people manage, they feel they can manage all the time. So they'll say, oh, we don't have that at school. And I think that sometimes, even if it isn't meant to be, I think perhaps parents particularly might hear that as, so it must be a problem you have at home. Therefore, that means you're a bad parent. And I think that's
I think that's really hard. And I think that that's partly down to, I mean, people like us, for example, Rebekah, in terms of education about that, just because they look like they're okay, it really doesn't mean that they are. And I think, you know, sometimes we just really need to explain that to people because people don't understand it. I think from a parent and from a young person's point of view, it must feel like the school don't understand, or they think that there's a reason that it's happening at home. Whereas we know that, you know, masking all day is absolutely exhausting. The people who can tell us about it describe how exhausting it is to look okay all day, to hear all this noise, to get from classroom to classroom, to be in a room with all these people, and to constantly hold that in all day is a miracle that people can do it. I really admire people who have the ability to do that, but it's at such a cost. It is at such a cost to them because they are absolutely exhausted by the time they get home. I think, again, some of that, if you think about it in terms of the bucket model, by the time they get home, their bucket's overspilling. We often, all of us, don't put a hole in our bucket until it's quite late. We're not very good at doing proactive and preventative stuff. So I would be encouraging the school to say they might look okay, they might look like they're managing really, really well. And even if they are, they still need a bit of downtime. They need that every day, and they still need that downtime because that's what's going to keep their stress levels lower rather than waiting until they're too full.
I'm just going to the bottom of the questions again. And thinking about girls who mask, I think it isn't just girls who mask, but I do, I do think that girls are often much later to be diagnosed, and often people are still saying after diagnosis, yeah, I'm not sure that it's ASD. And what we're saying is it is important we get it right, but it's also important to think about what that means. If we are using the bucket model, that's one of the main things to do. Like we're saying, and people have more than one bucket, and with, you know, families can have a bucket each, or might have a family bucket. Because actually, I think we have to be very sensible to say that nothing works once, does it? It works today, not tomorrow. It might work for months and months, and then people say, oh, it's much worse again. So we do think, I think also people talk about being tired and calming bedtime routine as well. And someone's adding in about miles to come home.
And I think, yeah, I think as well, I think one of the mistakes that we as services certainly make, and we probably make it for ourselves in our personal lives, is that when we're, you know, when we're really stressed, and when I say stressed, I include in that anxiety, depression, other forms of mental illness, close to having a meltdown or having a meltdown. I use that term to sort of capture everything. It's often at those points that we then think about how we might help somebody to do something different, or we'll think about at that point what we're going to do. Whereas actually, you know, learning new skills, learning different ways of managing things is really unlikely to happen when we're really stressed. That's the worst time to try and learn anything or to do anything different. And it takes a long time to learn some new skills and learn different ways of doing that. And it has to become part of somebody's routine. So I think sometimes as services, we say when somebody's upset, we think that they should have this choice or this choice, but it's offered to them at the time when they're stressed, rather than, you know, really practicing it repeatedly at a time when they're not stressed, and they can take that on board and it can become absolutely part of their normal routine, so that when they are stressed, they haven't really got to think about it. It's something that's really familiar to them and something that they know how to do.
Just to jump in there, Rebekah, saw the comment from Joe about the extreme tiredness and calming before bedtime. I think the sort of the aim they were going for was the fact that they're extremely tired, but at the same time they're still wired, even though they've had that calming strategy, put bedtime routine and everything. So is there something they can do to stop?
Well, I think we have to think about what calm is for one person isn't calm for something else. So if you're really wired and your thoughts or your mind or your head or whatever is going a million miles an hour, saying go from that down to a nice bath and a candle, which some people might find calming, is a bit unrealistic and also not very kind. So really, is it about finding something that's less wired than they are, but doesn't look like what we might all, or some people might find calming? So some people say to me, well, I took them, you know, they wanted to have really loud music when they went to bed, but if that loud music or the fast music was still quieter than their mind was, it might be a good starting point. So I think we have to think of, so sometimes that can be really useful to think about what's a bit less than they already are. So can we start coming down just a bit at a time, rather than expecting people to go from wired to calm. And I think that could be quite useful. I know that Nancy do some really good bedtime ideas about thinking about different ways of going to, I don't know if they're on the talk today, but different ways of thinking about nighttime routines, not just being that kind of what we might all think of as calm traditionally. But I don't know, also don't know if there's in particular about this youngster that we could also think about.
And I think, again, it's that bit about, isn't it, no judgment and everything being individual. So what might be holes in one person's bucket might be stuff that fills somebody else's bucket out. So I think we have some ideas about what we think, like you say, what we think nighttime should look like. That might need to look really different for different people. And it's really hard to know about, you know, specific examples without understanding. But for some people, because of their developmental differences, really high energy stuff is actually really soothing and really calming for them, and makes them feel much better than something that might, you know, look, you know, traditionally more calming for them.
I guess if we were to use a really clear example of slightly different question, but example of if youngsters with ADHD, the attention deficit, are giving a stimulant medication which would traditionally stimulate them, but therefore it calms down, or when people who have inattention may have an energy drink or a coffee, which then calms them down. We have to think about, we have to think slightly differently to what we might think about people having to calm down. So if we were to think, well, actually, like Mel's saying she likes to go to the gym, lift weights or whatever, that helps her de-stress and calm down. You wouldn't necessarily think about that being something you do at night time to calm down. But so I think it's about finding the right thing for that person, but without taking away the fact that the rest of the house is trying to calm down maybe, and we're saying
on that point, Rebekah, I must say, I mean, I as someone with ADHD myself, I do what most parents would think is the worst thing, is I have YouTube going, I have a fan in the room, I can't sleep. If there's any noise, if there's no noise and it's silent, my head goes 10 to the dozen. So I can't sleep. So I very much live sort of, there's always sound around me to relax me. So like my parents used to walk into my room once I finally got to sleep, and my speakers would be going and everything, and there I am passed out.
Yeah.
So it's maybe
that's a brilliant example.
Yeah, absolutely. It's better to find what's right for you, isn't it? And I think we have to fit in to a point to a family. We have to understand that not everybody wants to be hearing stuff. But you know, I don't know if you'd have the way having headphones on. I know lots of people have white noise now on their phones, or you can buy white noise boxes, just as something that's also on that can just keep your head ticking round in a way that you need it to get to sleep. Yeah, if I can't do one thing at once, I can't watch TV without doing something else. I need more than one thing. But that's right. If that's right for me, I can do that. But actually, like you say, if you need a fan on and things on, and I don't know that youngster, but if that potentially thinking is something to be added in to help them calm, it's got to be individual to them. I'm not saying it's going to work every time for everybody, but just thinking about a head that's really busy, a less than that busy would help get to sleep, rather than necessarily looking like being very quiet in a bedroom with the lights off.
And again, it's thinking about how you get to that point, isn't it? Because we all settle to sleep best with a routine, but we know that setting up a new routine takes time. Clear start and ends take time. Also, our instinct, like some of the young people I work with, when they are really upset, whether that's bedtime or another time, my instinct is that I want to go to them and I want to talk to them and I want to be with them and I want to comfort them. And for some people that's great, but for some people that is absolutely not the right thing to do. And I worry that sometimes it might look like I'm being cruel, but some of the young people have said or communicated in their own way, they don't want me to be using words at those times and they don't want me to be doing that, and I'm just adding more noise to it, or I'm adding more stuff to their bucket. So it's all of those things together, isn't it, that we need to think about what's right for that person rather than what we might think is the right way to do it.
And someone's just saying on that, they're saying that when their youngster comes out of school, they like to stay in their room until dinner time, and they're never really sure if they should leave them there or make them come down. And I think probably a lot of people in the room may echo the same conversation. And I think sometimes people do. Sometimes some youngsters will hear that, you know, they might need to go to the park or run in the garden or play football for an hour after school to be able to distress in their way, and other youngsters need to go and sit in front of the computer for an hour or just go and lay in the room or whatever it is they want to do. And I think if it works, I think that's okay. And I think people worry that they are isolating their youngster or allowing them to isolate, and that will come problems in the future. But I think actually helping people to be resilient and find a way for them to manage is actually much more important for the future. So you know where, you know, what you need to be calm or need to be able to manage. So, I mean, I don't know if that, Rob, I don't know if you're asking about leaving them in there longer, or if you're just saying, do we think it's okay that youngsters can be in the room for a bit, then come down to dinner, then they're together again? Well, actually, I wonder if he wasn't in the room for that bit after school, if they'd be able to come down to dinner, if not. So I don't think it's unkind or cruel for people to have what they need.
Absolutely no. And I think, you know, lots of, I'm particularly talking about autism because I guess that's perhaps more my experience, but lots of adults I know who are autistic, and lots of adults who write about their experiences or talk about it will say, you know, I wish people would stop being so polite and keep thinking that they need to sit with me and keep talking to me. I just want to be left alone for 2 hours with no one bothering me, and it's not being rude, but that is what I need to empty my bucket and to feel okay again. So it might not be right for some people, but equally I think if that's what that person wants or that child wants, then that's probably a really, really good strategy.
Sorry to jump in, I've just had the nod from Lee that we're going to have to sort of start wrapping up now, as he's going to have to start doing a talk in the other room.
Just briefly, because I'm aware that people are really frustrated by gaps in services, and I completely understand that. I guess Rebekah and I are constantly campaigning it as well. But what we're hoping for, it's not to fill a gap in services because we need to do much more. But one of the things we're hoping for is to try and arrange much more in-depth training to parents or teachers or other people about autism and mental health, or neurodevelopmental and mental health, to try and give a lot more people that information rather than waiting until people start bouncing around from services. So I guess if people have got ideas about things that could be better, please feel free to keep shouting them and keep sharing them, and we will keep doing the same, because it's going to need to be a joined up effort from everybody to make things much better.
And I don't know if people have been, I wasn't on it, but people have been on the ND all age NDD board talk that was, I think, before this one, I think. But if, I'm sure they were told on there already, but if you go to the website for that, and I'm sure that Lee can share that already on the Helping Hands page, there's going to be a section on there now that people can add information, comments that we can take on the minutes to the meeting, to the NDD board, for those if you go to the meeting. So that might be another way as well to make sure that it's, you know, people do know it's not just us saying it, but if people have ideas or queries or frustrations, that'll be another good way to get information to the right people as well. So we can make sure all services have that. I don't know if that's Ben, that was before us, wasn't it? I think so. I guess they probably already shared that information, but I'll get the links will be on the pages of that as well. So if I ask Lee to put the link on there to say, I'm sure he already has, but if people want to share information there as well as, you know, so we don't have all the answers certainly, but we can certainly make sure the right people here as well, that we can all start, you know, we all are hearing the same conversations, but do tell people and do share, because we, you know, we all think we know what people need, and we all listen, and we all hear the complaints, and we all try to offer, but we need to make sure we're getting it right. And if we're offering new services and that's not working for people, then we need to know that too.
There are links if when the when this closes, there is a marketplace, and if you go in there, they've got the Autism Partnership Board.
Yes.
Right.
Links all in there, and for any of our speakers, they're all going to be there. And if you missed the talk, from tomorrow, there will be links on the site put up where the recordings of all the meetings that happened today, so that if anyone missed any, you can then rewatch them there for 14 days, I think it is. Yeah, 14 days.
And someone's just put emails for us. They should hopefully still be on the screen for people to see.
Yeah, they're still there.
Great. I'm sorry if I've certainly missed some of the chat because I couldn't do that and do the screen share at the same time. So I'm sorry, obviously we were never going to capture everything in such a short time, but perhaps it's something we need to pick up with further events and more training and better services in the long term.
Thank you guys so much for doing this afternoon and taking time out of your day for us. It's been a really good session. I've really enjoyed it. But we can send a transcript of the chat as well to you guys if you want to read through.
That'd be really helpful, because I think there's some personal. There's some bits and pieces in there that are very direct questions. No, obviously I don't know who I can maybe have a guess who the people are, but I don't know who they are. It's really useful just to have that if that's possible. Thank you.
Definitely, we will get that to you guys. But thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
And you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.